The sky over Dargan 5 was a sickly shade of green, its twin suns casting elongated shadows across the jagged terrain. Captain Elias Carter knelt in the dust, his pulse pounding against his skull. His HUD flickered erratically, static consuming the edges of his visor display. His squad was gone, either dead or too far to respond. The last radio transmission had been a scream, then silence. His left shoulder ached where shrapnel had lodged deep during the ambush. He could still see the smoking wreckage of the dropship in the valley below, the charred bodies of his fellow soldiers scattered like discarded dolls. Varshak war bands had descended upon them, massive figures wielding plasma glaives, their guttural battle cries shattering the eerie quiet of the wasteland. He had fought, killed, bled, but alone, wounded, and out of ammunition, survival had become a grim calculation. A ridge loomed ahead, a cave mouth hidden beneath the overhang of black stone. It was his only chance to escape the scorching winds and whatever beasts prowled the ruins of this battlefield. He staggered forward, weapon held tight, every step a battle against the dizziness creeping at the edges of his vision. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with the scent of damp minerals. He pressed his back against the cavern wall, exhaling slowly. Assess, breathe, regroup. He reached for his medkit, yanking out a vial of coagulant, and jammed the needle into his shoulder. The sting barely registered. Then, a noise low, resonant, like the growl of shifting tectonic plates. Elias froze. The shadows ahead deepened, shifting unnaturally. Then he saw them, two massive, glowing eyes like molten amber, staring from the darkness. A shape moved, 8 feet tall, broad, powerful, a Varshak warrior. Elias' fingers tightened on the grip of his sidearm, but he knew it was useless. His pistol would barely slow a creature of that size. The Varshak had wiped out entire battalions. Yet the alien did not attack. The warrior stepped forward, its hulking frame limned by the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi clinging to the cavern walls. Its body was marked by deep wounds, plasma burns still sizzling against dark, scaled flesh. The armor it wore, ceremonial, adorned with bone charms, was cracked, evidence of a recent brutal battle. Elias met its gaze, not with defiance, not with fear, but with the understanding that they were both alone, injured, trapped. A slow, tense moment stretched between them. Then, with deliberate slowness, Elias lowered his weapon. The Varshak warrior, Talker, if Elias could trust the symbols etched into the alien's armor, watched him unreadable. Its chest rose and fell in heavy, labored breaths. Elias tapped a gloved finger against his own chest. "Elias," he said, voice hoarse. A flicker of understanding crossed the alien's face. A deep, rumbling sound emerged, distorted by the guttural nature of the Varshak tongue. Then, to Elias' shock, Talker collapsed. Instinct overrode hesitation. Elias lunged forward, catching the massive creature's weight against his own, a ridiculous effort, like trying to hold up a collapsing wall. The Varshak hit the cavern floor, exhaling sharply. Elias crouched beside him, scanning the alien's injuries. Plasma burns across the torso, deep gashes along the arms. And something else, a wound at the base of the neck, seeping an eerie, dark blue fluid. Poison. Elias hissed a curse. He had seen this before. Varshak weapons often carried neurotoxic compounds, meant to ensure a slow, agonizing death. If Talker had been hit by one of his own kind's weapons, he wouldn't last the night. Elias didn't stop to think. He reached for his medkit. Talker stirred weakly as Elias worked, amber eyes watching his every move. The alien could have killed him at any moment. Even half dead, he was still stronger than any human. But he didn't. As Elias injected a counteragent into the alien's wound, a strange silence settled between them. Trust had not yet been earned, but something unspoken had been acknowledged. By dawn, neither of them would be the same. Elias woke to the sound of shifting stone. Instinct had him reaching for his sidearm before his brain caught up. The cavern walls pulsed with the dim glow of bioluminescent fungi, casting long, distorted shadows. Tucker was awake. The 8-foot alien giant sat against the rock wall, his breathing still labored but no longer on the brink of death. The crude bandaging Elias had applied to the warrior's wounds remained in place. Dried traces of dark blue Varshak blood crusted the floor between them. Tucker's molten amber gaze flicked to Elias, then to the pistol in his grip. Elias exhaled and lowered the weapon. "You're welcome," he muttered, rolling his aching shoulder. Tucker tilted his head, the movement slow, assessing. Then, in a voice like grinding stone, he rumbled, "Elias." Elias stilled. The alien's voice was deeper than expected, almost too resonant for the confined space. But it wasn't the sound that surprised him. It was the fact that Tucker had remembered his name. So, communication was possible. Elias tapped his chest. "Elias." Tucker's eyes narrowed slightly before he thumped a massive, clawed fist against his own armored chest. "Tucker, progress." Elias nodded, chewing on his next move. Words weren't enough. He needed something clearer. Slowly, he reached down, found a sharp rock, and dragged its edge across the cavern floor. A crude line. Tucker watched. Elias drew a second shape, his dropship burning, jagged lines indicating smoke and wreckage. Then, a rough figure of himself, alone. He pointed at the drawing, then at himself. Lost. Alone. Tucker made a low noise in his throat, then extended a massive clawed finger, carving his own marks beside Elias' sketch. His was simple. A towering figure surrounded by smaller ones. Then, a slash through them all. Dead. Elias blinked. He hadn't expected that. So, Tucker hadn't been some mindless warrior from the enemy ranks. He was just like Elias. Stranded, without a unit, without a home. A quiet understanding settled between them. For a while, neither spoke. They sat in their own pools of exhaustion, listening to the distant howl of the alien winds outside. Then Tucker shifted. The motion was slow, deliberate. His massive clawed hands reached to the straps of his cracked armor. With visible effort, he unfastened them and let the heavy plating slump to the cavern floor. The warrior's scorched torso was bare now, revealing a lattice of old scars beneath the fresh wounds Elias had patched. Every inch of him spoke of battle, of survival. Tucker extended his open palm toward Elias. A gesture, an offering. Elias hesitated, then carefully, he pressed his own hand to Tucker's. The Varshak's palm dwarfed his entirely, his skin rough like stone. Yet, Tucker's grip was steady, measured, not crushing. Elias had seen war, had fought beside humans who barely acknowledged him beyond rank and protocol. And yet here, in the dim glow of a dying cavern, an alien enemy was offering something more than survival. A bond. Something deep in Elias' gut told him that this wasn't a simple exchange of trust. To the Varshak, this meant something far greater. He just didn't know what. By the time morning arrived, necessity had driven them into something resembling teamwork. Elias was still weak from his wounds, and Tucker moved with a stiffness that betrayed how much he was enduring. They needed food, water, a plan. Elias gathered what little supplies he had left. A single ration bar, barely enough. Tucker, upon seeing the tiny portion, let out a deep, unimpressed snort. Then, without a word, he rose, retrieved his discarded glaive, and motioned toward the cavern's entrance. Elias frowned. "What? We're just Going outside. You're barely on your feet. Talker grunted, rolling a massive shoulder before gesturing sharply again. Come. Elias sighed. Great. Guess that's settled. Outside. The landscape stretched into desolation. Cracked black rock, toxic mist curling at the edges of the horizon. Strange. Towering formations jutted from the earth like jagged teeth. Talker moved with the silent precision of a predator, scanning the terrain with practiced ease. Elias followed, keeping his pistol at the ready, though it felt absurdly small compared to Talker's brutal glaive. Then, without warning, movement. Something skittered through the dust, a four-legged, reptilian beast, its armored hide blending into the terrain. Its mouth split open in a vertical snarl, revealing rows of needle-sharp fangs. Talker tensed. Elias barely had time to register the blur of motion before the alien giant moved. Faster than anything that size should. The battle was quick, brutal, efficient. Talker's glaive sliced through flesh and chitin, the predator's death cry echoing across the wasteland. Elias stood, tense, until the silence settled once more. Talker turned, yanked his blade free from the now motionless creature, then looked at Elias with something akin to expectation. Elias exhaled. Right, dinner. The strange thing was, as they dragged the kill back toward the cave, Elias realized he hadn't once thought about whether Talker would turn on him. That should have scared him. Instead, it only left him with more questions. Night fell, and the small fire they'd built flickered against the cavern walls. The scent of charred meat filled the space, blending with the mineral-rich damp of the cave. Talker had cooked most of the beast, using methods Elias didn't fully understand, but the result was edible. Elias sat with his back to the wall, chewing carefully. The taste was somewhere between venison and burnt rubber. Across from him, Talker ate in silence, his molten gaze unreadable. Then, abruptly, the alien reached into the small satchel at his waist and pulled something free. A shard of bone, polished, carved with intricate markings. Talker turned it between his fingers, then extended it toward Elias. Elias frowned. What is this? Talker's deep voice rumbled. Bond. The word sent a strange chill down Elias' spine. He hesitated, took the carved bone carefully between his fingers. The second his skin met it, something shifted. A strange pressure at the base of his skull, not pain, but an undeniable presence, like a door had been unlocked in the back of his mind. He looked at Talker, but the alien warrior only watched. Waiting, Elias swallowed. Whatever he had just accepted, it was far more than a simple gift, and something told him there was no turning back. The bond sat heavy in Elias' mind. It wasn't something he could touch, yet it was there, like a faint whisper at the edge of his thoughts. Every time his gaze met Talker's, an unspoken weight passed between them, a presence more profound than words. And he was beginning to understand. Not just words, intentions. Talker's body language, his expressions, the way his muscles tensed in response to danger. Elias felt them in a way he couldn't explain, like an instinct that wasn't his own. The bone shard rested in his pocket, smooth against his fingers. It had changed something. They had only a few hours of uneasy quiet before the distant rumble of engines shattered the stillness. Elias' breath hitched. That sound, he knew it. Human dropships. Talker had already moved to the cavern's entrance, his massive frame a silhouette against the blinding horizon. His people hadn't come, but Elias had. Elias rose, his chest tightening with something between relief and dread. This was what he had wanted. A way home, a way off this dying planet. But as he stepped forward, his gaze snapped to Talker, and the weight of reality slammed into him like a hammer. What would they do to him? A Varshak warrior, standing at the side of a human soldier. It didn't matter that they had fought together, that they had saved each other. The war wasn't over, and humans didn't take chances with enemies. The moment Elias stepped from the cave, he heard the sharp crackle of radio static before his comms reactivated. Carter, a familiar voice, commanding, sharp, Lieutenant Hale. Elias lifted his hand to his earpiece. "Alive," he said. "I need a medic and—" His words cut off as red targeting lasers snapped onto Tucker's chest. "Contact! Contact! Enemy combatant! Wait!" The warning shot hit the ground inches from Tucker's feet. The Varshak didn't flinch, but Elias saw his fingers tense around his glaive. The human squad, 3 soldiers, fully armed, visors glowing, spread out in formation, weapons trained. Their stances were locked in kill mode. Hale's voice cracked through the comms. "Step away from the alien, Carter." Elias turned, blocking their line of fire. "He's not a threat." Tucker's amber gaze burned into him, but the warrior did not step back. "Like hell he's not," Hale spat. Carter moved now. "Listen to me," Elias growled, his own pulse hammering. "He's injured. He's alone. We saved each other out here. If we—" A deafening sound split the air, not human, not mechanical, but deep, guttural, and furious. Another dropship appeared on the horizon. Tucker straightened, shoulders squared. His people had come after all. The Varshak hit the ground like a thunderstorm. 3 warriors, dropping from the ship's open hatch, their armored bulk sending tremors through the earth. Their clawed feet dug into the rock, their glaives gleaming in the burning light. One of them stepped forward, towering even among his own kind. His armor bore the markings of a war leader. Tucker stiffened. Recognition, a name unspoken. Elias knew, then this was personal. The leader's molten eyes locked onto Tucker. A string of low, growling words passed between them. Elias didn't need a translation to understand. "Why do you stand with the enemy?" Tucker's shoulders shifted, his grip on his glaive firm, but he did not raise it. The leader's gaze flicked to Elias. A sneer, a promise of death. Elias' human squad hadn't lowered their weapons either. And just like that, they were standing between 2 armies, neither willing to accept what had been forged between them. Tucker rumbled something under his breath. Elias heard the words in his mind as clearly as if they had been his own. "They will not let us leave together." Elias swallowed, his throat dry. "Then we don't give them a choice." Tucker's expression barely shifted, but Elias felt the flicker of approval beneath the warrior's unreadable gaze. Then the first shot rang out. Sacrifice for the bond. The battle was a blur of motion and sound. Plasma fire, the clash of steel, the roar of warriors and soldiers alike. Tucker moved like lightning, his glaive sweeping through the chaos with terrifying efficiency. Elias stayed close, covering his flank, taking precise shots where he could. They fought together like they had always known how. But there were too many. Elias' rifle jammed just as a Varshak warrior lunged. A blur of dark-scaled muscle intercepted the blow. Tucker, the glaive meant for Elias, sank deep into Tucker's side instead. Elias felt the pain before he saw it. A sharp, searing sensation that wasn't his, but still somehow was. Tucker staggered, blood pouring from the wound. The Varshak leader stood over him now, a look of grim finality in his molten gaze. Elias moved before thinking. He slammed into the warrior's side, knocking him back, then turned, hands grasping Tucker's massive frame before he could fall completely. The battle faded around him. "Stay with me." Elias' voice was raw, desperate. Tucker gripped his forearm, claws digging into the fabric of Elias' sleeve. His gaze burned, but his body was failing. The bond pulsed between them, an unspoken truth Elias could finally understand. If one of them did not stop this, neither would survive. He looked up, the human soldiers, the Varshak warriors, all watching, waiting for the final strike. Elias' hands tightened into fists, and then, against all instinct, against everything war had ever taught him, he dropped his weapon. A slow, deliberate motion, surrender, defiance, both at once. Tucker followed his lead. His glaive hit the ground with a dull thud. Silence crashed over the battlefield. The war had not ended, but something else had begun. The silence was thick with uncertainty, the air still humming with the heat of plasma fire. Elias stood firm, his empty hands raised at his sides. Beside him, Tucker remained upright through sheer will, his massive frame trembling from blood loss. The gash in his side still oozed dark blue fluid, pooling at his feet. On one side of the battlefield, Lieutenant Hale and his squad had their rifles at the ready, shifting uneasily at Elias' open defiance. On the other, the Varshak leader loomed, his piercing amber gaze locked onto Tucker. No one moved. No one dared. Elias' pulse pounded in his ears. He knew exactly what he looked like. A human soldier standing unarmed beside a wounded alien giant, a traitor in the eyes of his own kind, a liability to the Varshak. But the bond between them pulsed with a truth he could no longer deny. He had made his choice. The first to break the silence was Hale. "Carter," he said, voice tight measured. "Step away. That's an order." Elias didn't move. His jaw clenched. No. A flicker of disbelief passed over Hale's face before it hardened into something more dangerous. "Damn it, Carter. We don't negotiate with hostiles. This war isn't over." Elias felt Tucker shift beside him, but the warrior said nothing. His gaze never left his own people. Elias swallowed the knot of frustration rising in his throat. "You didn't see what I saw, Lieutenant. He's not just some enemy soldier. He saved my life. I saved his. That has to mean something." Hale exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on his rifle. "It means you're compromised." The word stung more than it should have. Elias turned to the Varshak leader, choosing his next words carefully. "This doesn't have to end in blood." The alien's molten gaze flicked between Elias and Tucker, something unreadable shifting in his expression. When he spoke, his voice was deep-layered, as if it carried the weight of an entire culture behind it. "You bear the bond of a warrior," he rumbled. "Yet you stand among those who would see us dead." Elias met his gaze, heart hammering. "Maybe that means it's time we stop acting like we have to kill each other." The Varshak leader was silent for a long moment. Then, to Elias' surprise, he let out a low, considering growl. A flicker of something like respect passed through his gaze. He turned to Tucker, his expression shifting to something sharper, more familiar. A commander speaking to his soldier. A series of low, guttural words passed between them. Tucker, still weak, held the alien leader's gaze, then nodded once. Elias felt the shift before he fully understood it. Tucker had made his choice too. The Varshak leader finally turned away, motioning to his warriors. Just like that, the battle was over before it began. The massive dropship roared to life, dust and heat kicking up in the air as the Varshak prepared to leave. Tucker took one step toward them, then hesitated. Elias saw it, felt it. Something unspoken passed between them. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Tucker reached into the satchel at his side and retrieved something small, another carved bone shard, marked with intricate symbols. He extended it toward Elias. Elias didn't hesitate this time. He took it, his fingers brushing against Tucker's clawed palm. The weight of it wasn't just physical. It was a promise, one that Elias didn't fully understand. But he would. Tucker turned without a word and strode toward his people. Elias watched as the Varshak disappeared into the ship, the massive hatch closing behind them. Then, with a final thunderous roar, the alien vessel lifted into the sky, vanishing beyond the clouds, leaving Elias behind. Elias exhaled, only now realizing how unsteady his breath was. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Hale stepped closer, his voice quieter now. What the hell just happened? Elias turned the small bone shard over in his fingers, its strange carvings catching the light. I think, he murmured, we just changed the war. Hale let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face. Then, finally, he sighed, get on the damn dropship, Carter. Elias nodded, pocketing the bone shard. He turned toward the waiting human vessel, stepping forward, feeling the weight of everything that had come before, and everything that had yet to come. As the engines roared to life, he looked up one last time, toward the sky where the Varshak had disappeared. A bond had been formed, a new path had been carved, and Elias knew, deep in his bones, that this was only the beginning.